May 23, 1941, Aspley Guys, Bedfordshire, England. Peter Seckelmann sat alone in a converted brick house they called the Rookery, staring at a microphone that would broadcast lies to 50 million Germans. His hands trembled, not from fear, from the weight of what he was about to become. In 6 minutes, he would transform from a refugee bomb disposal technician into der Chef, a fanatical Nazi broadcasting from inside the Third Reich itself. The Gestapo would hunt for this station. They would tear Germany apart, searching for a transmitter that existed 600 miles away in enemy territory. And the secret that Churchill himself had authorized wouldn't be declassified for 50 years. What Seckelmann didn't know as he adjusted his headphones was that he'd just become the first soldier in the most sophisticated deception campaign in military history. A campaign that would fool not just German soldiers, but Hitler's intelligence chief, Joseph Goebbels, American embassy officials in Berlin, and even some Allied commanders. A campaign where British operatives would impersonate dead German soldiers, forge millions of documents with microscopic precision, and broadcast pornographic content mixed with military intelligence to destroy enemy morale from within. The political warfare executive was about to wage a war where words were more dangerous than bullets, and where the truth became the deadliest lie of all. By May 1941, the war was going catastrophically for Britain. France had fallen. The Luftwaffe was bombing London nightly. Wehrmacht forces controlled Western Europe from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean. And in the battle for mines, Britain was losing decisively. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had perfected the art of psychological warfare. His Reich ministry controlled every newspaper, radio station, and film production in occupied Europe. German propaganda depicted the British as cowardly imperialists, starving Europe while German soldiers brought order and prosperity. The numbers told a brutal story. Goebbels commanded over 14,000 propaganda officials. His ministry produced 1,200 films, controlled 3,600 newspapers, and operated 85 radio stations. BBC broadcasts to occupied Europe were jammed, filtered, or drowned out by German counter-programming. British intelligence faced a fundamental problem. White propaganda, clearly identified as coming from Allied sources, was automatically dismissed as enemy lies. Grey propaganda, where the source was ambiguous, lacked credibility. What they needed was something unprecedented, black propaganda that appeared to come from inside Germany itself. But creating believable Nazi broadcasts from London seemed impossible. The details required were staggering. They'd need native German speakers who understood regional dialects, military slang, and current events inside the Reich. They'd need intelligence so current that broadcasts could reference bomb damage to specific streets before official German announcements. They'd need forgers capable of replicating Nazi documents down to the paper fibers and ink composition. And they'd need a transmitter powerful enough to convince listeners it was broadcasting from German soil, when it actually operated from the English countryside. The conventional wisdom among British officials was that such deception was impossible to sustain. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden initially opposed the entire concept. Sir Stafford Cripps, Lord Privy Seal, would later write, "If this is the sort of thing that is needed to win the war, why, I'd rather lose it." But Winston Churchill saw what others missed. On May 16, 1941, he authorized development of what he called a new powerful weapon, one that used no bullets or explosions. Just words, perfectly calibrated words delivered with surgical precision to exploit every crack in German military morale. In August 1941, Churchill consolidated Britain's scattered propaganda efforts under a single organization, the Political Warfare Executive. Headquartered at the requisitioned Woburn Abbey in Bedfordshire, PWE operated under such secrecy that staff used the cover name Political Intelligence Department. Its mission was unprecedented in military history: systematically deceive an entire nation, using its own voice against itself. Robert Bruce Lockhart was appointed Director General. A former diplomat who spoke fluent German and Russian, Lockhart understood something fundamental about psychological warfare. The most effective lies are 90% truth. PWE's structure reflected this philosophy. It divided propaganda into three categories: white propaganda, openly identified British sources; grey propaganda, ambiguous sourcing; black propaganda, completely disguised to appear as enemy transmissions. The black operations required something Britain had never attempted. They needed to recruit Germans who could think like Nazis, sound like Nazis, and fool actual Nazis into believing they were hearing their own people, and they found their mastermind in the most unlikely place. Sefton Delmer had been born in Berlin in 1904 to Australian parents. His father taught English literature at Berlin University. Young Delmer grew up speaking German with a perfect Berliner accent, attending German schools, playing with German children. When World War I broke out, his father was interned as an enemy alien. But Delmer returned to Germany in the 1930s as a journalist for the Daily Express. He interviewed Hitler in 1931. Traveled on Hitler's private aircraft during the 1932 election. Witnessed the Reichstag fire in 1933. The British government suspected him of being a Nazi sympathizer. The Nazis were convinced he was MI6. Both were wrong. Delmer was simply a journalist who understood the German psyche better than any Englishman alive. When war broke out, Delmer returned to Britain and joined the BBC German service. On September 3, 1939, Hitler broadcast a speech offering Britain peace terms. Delmer responded immediately, without authorization, in perfect colloquial German. "Herr Hitler and Reichskanzler, we hurl it right back at you, right in your evil-smelling teeth." The response caused chaos in both Berlin and London. Goebbels believed it had to be an official government statement. The British government was appalled at the unauthorized outburst. But the impact was undeniable. Hitler added Delmer's name to the special search list for immediate arrest after the planned invasion of Britain. In 1941, PWE recruited Delmer to run their black propaganda operations. His first task: create a radio station that would fool German intelligence into believing it was an underground resistance broadcast. The station would need a name that sounded official but meaningless. Delmer chose the German phonetic alphabet, Gustav Siegfried I, GS1. The call sign was brilliant in its ambiguity. Did GS1 mean Geheimsender 1, Secret Transmitter 1, or Generalstab 1, General Staff 1? Listeners would assume it meant something when it actually meant nothing at all. For the voice of GS1, Delmer needed someone who could play an impossible character. Der Chef had to be a fanatical Nazi who nevertheless attacked Hitler's inner circle, a Prussian military veteran who supported Germany while condemning party corruption, a patriot who revealed state secrets to save the fatherland from Nazi incompetence. Delmer found his actor in a bomb disposal squad. Peter Seckelmann had fled Germany in 1938 after writing detective novels the regime deemed subversive. He joined the Pioneer Corps, spending his days defusing unexploded bombs in London. At night, he would become the most dangerous voice in Germany. The technical requirements were staggering. GS1 needed to broadcast on shortwave frequencies that could reach deep into Germany. The signal had to be strong enough to seem plausibly German in origin. They recorded programs on glass discs at a studio in Wavendon Towers, then transported them to transmission sites at Gorcott and Pottsgrove. But technology alone wasn't enough. The content had to be absolutely authentic. Delmer built an intelligence apparatus specifically to feed GS1 with current information. POW interrogations provided military gossip and unit movements. Resistance operatives smuggled out newspapers and official documents. RAF bomber crews filed debriefing reports noting which buildings they'd hit in German cities. This intelligence network was so comprehensive that GS1 could broadcast lists of streets destroyed in air raids before German radio acknowledged the damage. They could name officers transferred between units before their families knew. They could discuss black market shortages in specific neighborhoods with intimate accuracy. Der Chef's character was carefully calculated. He opened every broadcast with the same format. Hier ist Gustav Siegfried I. Es spricht der Chef. Then he'd launch into commentary that was designed to be accepted by the German psyche. He praised German soldiers while attacking Nazi bureaucrats. He condemned Churchill as that flat-footed son of a drunken Jew, while accusing Goebbels of betraying the Nazi revolution. He spoke of party corruption, sexual scandals among officials, and profiteering by connected industrialists. The pornographic element was deliberate. Delmer called it propaganda by pornography, using forbidden content to attract listeners, then mixing in subversive messages. Der Chef described in graphic detail the alleged sexual misconduct of Nazi officials, party leaders with mistresses, generals visiting Berlin brothels while soldiers froze on the Eastern Front, SS officers hoarding luxuries while civilians ate turnips. Every accusation was just plausible enough to be believed. The Gestapo went frantic, trying to find the transmitter. They deployed radio direction finding equipment across Germany. They arrested dozens of suspects. They never imagined the broadcasts originated in England. American embassy officials in Berlin reported back to President Franklin Roosevelt about GS1 as evidence of growing friction between the Wehrmacht and the Nazi Party. Roosevelt laughed when he later learned the truth. Even he had been fooled. The German High Command knew GS1 existed but couldn't locate it. Wehrmacht signals intelligence detected the broadcasts and tried to jam them. Abwehr, German military intelligence, assigned analysts to determine the broadcaster's identity. Some suspected an underground resistance cell with a mobile transmitter. Others believed it was dissent within the Wehrmacht General Staff. The confusion was exactly what Delmer wanted. GS1 ran for 700 broadcasts between May 1941 and November 1943. Then Delmer decided Der Chef had to die. On GS1's final broadcast, listeners heard shouting in the background. Gunfire. A struggle. Der Chef's voice cut off mid-sentence. The dramatic death was supposed to suggest the Gestapo had finally caught Der Chef. But in a perfect encapsulation of the entire operation, a non-German-speaking transmitter engineer accidentally repeated the broadcast the next day. Listeners heard Der Chef murdered twice. It should have exposed the deception. Instead, it added to the legend. People assumed they'd heard a recording of the actual raid. By late 1943, Delmer had learned everything GS1 could teach him about psychological warfare. He was ready to deploy those lessons on an unprecedented scale. What came next would be the most sophisticated black propaganda operation in history. On November 14, 1943, a new station began broadcasting. Soldatensender Calais, Soldiers Radio Calais. Unlike GS1's shortwave frequencies, Soldatensender Calais broadcast on medium wave at 833 kHz. It pretended to be a Wehrmacht station for German troops in occupied France. The transmitter for this operation was extraordinary. Radio Corporation of America had built two 200-kilowatt transmitters for American broadcasters. When the FCC imposed a 50-kilowatt power limit, RCA couldn't use them domestically. The British Secret Intelligence Service bought both and combined them into a single 500-kilowatt monster. Briefly the world's most powerful medium-wave transmitter. They codenamed it Aspidistra. It was installed in an underground bunker near Crowborough in Sussex. Chief Engineer Harold Robin modified it so the frequency could be changed in a fraction of a second, the same ease as changing car radio stations. This meant Aspidistra could hop frequencies faster than German jamming equipment could track it. Soldatensender Calais used a deception method Delma called cover, cover, dirt, cover, dirt. The formula was simple but devastating. Broadcast genuine entertainment and accurate news to build trust. Then slip in propaganda so subtle most listeners wouldn't consciously register it. The station's lineup was designed to be irresistible. American jazz and swing music, banned in Germany. German dance music and sentimental songs. Accurate sports scores from German leagues. News bulletins that were often more current than official Wehrmacht communications. Agnes Bernell, using the codename Vicky, anchored the broadcasts from a purpose-built studio at Milton Bryan in Bedfordshire. Unlike GS1's recordings, Soldatensender Calais aired live from 6 p.m. until dawn, exactly when soldiers off duty would be listening. The news segments were masterful examples of psychological manipulation. PWE's intelligence analysts monitored every German radio station, newspaper, and captured document. When RAF bombers returned from raids, crews filed detailed reports of what they'd hit. This allowed Soldatensender Calais to broadcast lists of destroyed streets in Berlin before German radio acknowledged the raids. The accuracy built devastating trust. German commanders tuned in to Soldatensender Calais because its situation reports were more reliable than Wehrmacht communications. Officers used the broadcasts to update their staff maps with current Allied positions. One captured German intelligence officer admitted, "We knew it was enemy propaganda, but we needed the information." The dirt, propaganda designed to demoralize, came in forms so subtle they seemed like facts. Reports about confidence men swindling soldiers being transferred from France to Russia. Stories about factory workers in Germany hoarding goods while soldiers starved. Rumors about party officials' wives shopping in Switzerland while German women made do with ersatz coffee. None of it was overtly anti-Nazi. Der Chef had screamed about corruption. Soldatensender Calais simply reported it as news. The impact was far more insidious. The station also broadcast grey propaganda alongside genuine Hitler speeches. By transmitting official Nazi content, Soldatensender Calais strengthened its cover as an authentic Wehrmacht station. But the positioning of those speeches next to certain news items created devastating ironic contrasts. Hitler declaring final victory, followed immediately by accurate casualty figures from the Eastern Front. Goebbels himself recognized the danger. In November 1943, he wrote in his diary, "The station does a very clever job of propaganda, and from what is put on the air, one can gather that the English know exactly what they have destroyed in Berlin and what they have not." That Goebbels praised Soldatensender Calais while understanding it was British propaganda revealed the operation's sophistication. Even recognizing the deception, he couldn't neutralize its effectiveness. As D-Day approached, Soldatensender Calais became a strategic weapon. The station was integrated into Operation Fortitude, the massive deception plan to convince Germany the Normandy invasion would strike elsewhere. Beginning in early 1944, Soldatensender Calais broadcast subtle intelligence designed to support the Fortitude deception. Reports mentioned fictional troop buildups near Dover. Stories discussed supply problems in southeastern England. Weather reports for the Pas-de-Calais region. The information was never explicitly military intelligence. It came as incidental details in entertainment programs, weather updates, and supposed situation reports. German intelligence officers listening to Soldatensender Calais for tactical information absorbed Fortitude deception without recognizing it as deliberate misinformation. On June 6, 1944, Soldatensender Calais broke the news of the Normandy landings before German military communications confirmed it. The broadcast was so fast and accurate that it further cemented the station's credibility as a genuine Wehrmacht source. Then the station began broadcasting information suggesting the Normandy invasion was a feint, that the real attack would come at Calais. The deception worked. Hitler kept 15 divisions near Calais for weeks after D-Day, convinced the main invasion was still coming. Those divisions might have turned the tide at Omaha Beach or destroyed the Allied beachhead. Instead, they sat idle while Eisenhower's forces consolidated. Soldatensender Calais wasn't alone. PWE operated multiple black propaganda stations simultaneously. Kurzwellensender Atlantic targeted U-boat crews with shortwave broadcasts. Wehrmachtsender Nord broadcast to troops in Scandinavia. The German priest station broadcast religious content mixed with anti-Nazi messages. Each station had its own character, target audience, and deception methodology. But they all shared one crucial element: intelligence so accurate that German listeners trusted them more than their own government sources. The operations didn't stop at radio. PWE ran a master forgery operation that produced millions of documents. Forged ration cards encouraging German housewives to illegally overpurchase food, hoping to trigger shortages. Fake Luftwaffe airmail stamps, counterfeit identity papers, perfect replicas of Nazi party letterheads. The forgeries were forensically perfect. PWE maintained files on German paper mills, tracking fiber composition and watermarks. They analyzed German inks under microscopes, replicating chemical compositions. They studied printing techniques down to the pressure patterns of individual printing presses. One operation involved forging Nazi charity stamps. The Winter Hilfswerk organization issued stamps to raise money for winter relief. PWE created perfect forgeries showing grotesque images: a soldier with his face shot off, Himmler with a collection tin and gun. The stamps were distributed across occupied Europe, mixed with regular propaganda leaflets. Another operation targeted German food rationing. SOE and PWE studied the German rationing system in microscopic detail. They printed thousands of fake extra ration cards. RAF and 8th Air Force bombers dropped them over Germany. The goal wasn't primarily to distribute illegal rations. It was to create suspicion and social breakdown. When too many ration cards existed, shopkeepers would become paranoid about forgeries. Legitimate cardholders might be accused of fraud. The entire rationing system, critical to German home front morale, could unravel. Perhaps most controversial was an operation impersonating dead German soldiers. PWE obtained names of soldiers killed in action. They prepared food parcels with genuinely valuable contents: ham, chocolate, coffee. The parcels arrived at the soldiers' homes, supposedly sent before their deaths. Included were letters in the deceased soldier's handwriting, forged using samples from captured letters, expressing pacifist sentiments and war weariness. Families received what appeared to be final messages from their dead sons and husbands. The emotional impact was devastating and completely unverifiable. Who would question a dead man's last words? When Sefton Delmer later defended this operation, he quipped, "Although family hopes to see their loved ones were false, the ham was real." The dark humor revealed the operation's ruthless logic. Psychological warfare required exploiting every human vulnerability, including grief. The printed propaganda complemented radio operations. Nachrichten für die Truppe, News for the Troops, was a daily newspaper based on Soldatensender Calais broadcasts. It was written at PWE headquarters, printed overnight and airdropped over German positions. In the months around D-Day, American forces dropped an average of 250,000 copies nightly. The newspaper looked exactly like Wehrmacht publications. Same paper stock, same typography, same layout and design. But the content was grey, mixing accurate news with demoralization. Battlefield casualty figures, lists of units destroyed, reports from the home front about shortages and hardships. All technically true, but selected and presented to destroy fighting morale. Post-war interrogations revealed stunning effectiveness. Over 50% of German POWs admitted reading news for the troops. Many trusted it more than official German sources. Some soldiers collected multiple issues. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, was completely fooled by PWE operations. Captured documents showed Abwehr analysts spent hundreds of hours trying to locate GS1's transmitter. They generated detailed reports on Der Chef's identity, speculating he was a disgruntled Wehrmacht general. They never considered the broadcasts originated in England. The Abwehr's failure revealed a deeper intelligence disaster. British counterintelligence had captured or turned every single Abwehr agent sent to Britain. The double-cross system meant every piece of intelligence Germany received from Britain was controlled by British intelligence. Agents the Abwehr thought were reporting from London were actually sending information scripted by MI5. This meant Abwehr reports about British preparations were exactly what British intelligence wanted Germany to believe. When PWE's black propaganda reinforced those reports, German intelligence analysts saw confirmation from multiple independent sources. In reality, every source was British-controlled. The Abwehr was providing Germany with British intelligence disguised as German intelligence. The irony was perfect. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, was actually an anti-Nazi conspirator. He deliberately appointed anti-Nazi officers to key positions. Many Abwehr operations were purposely bungled. Intelligence reports were skewed to undermine Hitler's strategic decisions. Whether Canaris specifically knew about PWE's deception is unclear, but he certainly would have appreciated the irony. Germany's intelligence service was being systematically fooled by British propaganda that Germany's intelligence service mistook for its own intelligence. The scale of PWE's operations was staggering. By 1944, PWE employed over 1,000 staff. The organization produced 30 million leaflets per month. Radio broadcasts reached estimated audiences of 15 to 20 million Germans nightly. The forgery department produced over 50 different types of fake documents. The costs were equally impressive. Aspidistra transmitter cost $165,000, equivalent to over $10 million today. PWE's annual budget exceeded $2 million. RAF bomber missions dedicated to leaflet drops consumed thousands of flying hours. But the investment paid strategic dividends. Every minute German counterintelligence spent hunting Der Chef's phantom transmitter was time not spent on genuine security threats. Every radio direction finding team deployed to locate GS1 was equipment not used against genuine Allied intelligence operations. Every soldier who heard Soldatensender Calais absorbed subtle demoralization that accumulated over weeks. The psychological impact was cumulative rather than immediate. Individual broadcasts didn't cause soldiers to desert, but months of exposure to PWE propaganda created ambient demoralization. Trust in official communications eroded. Rumors spread faster than counter-propaganda could refute them. Combat effectiveness degraded as morale collapsed. The operations also had unintended benefits. PWE's intelligence gathering for propaganda purposes generated valuable military intelligence. Reports from bomber crews about damage assessment. POW interrogations that revealed unit morale and equipment status, captured documents showing German logistics and communications. All this information fed back into British intelligence analysis, creating a virtuous cycle. Better intelligence enabled more convincing propaganda. More convincing propaganda generated more intelligence through enemy reactions. As the war turned against Germany in 1944-1945, PWE operations intensified. When the Pas-de-Calais area was overrun after D-Day, Soldatensender Calais changed its call sign to Soldatensender West. The station continued broadcasting until April 30, 1945, the day Hitler committed suicide. The final broadcasts occurred as Allied forces closed in on Berlin. German soldiers listening to Soldatensender West heard accurate reports of Wehrmacht units surrendering, lists of roads still under German control shrinking daily, weather reports for regions now behind Allied lines. The station stopped broadcasting without announcement. One day the frequency was simply dead. For German soldiers who trusted Soldatensender for years, the silence conveyed a message louder than any broadcast. Even the enemy radio was gone. Germany had lost everything. The secrecy surrounding PWE operations was absolute. Like Bletchley Park's code-breaking work, PWE's activities remained classified for decades. Staff signed lifetime secrecy agreements. Documents were buried in classified archives. The rookery, where GS1 broadcast, remained unmarked. The Aspidistra transmitter site at Crowborough was bulldozed. Milton Bryan's studio was demolished. Physical evidence was systematically destroyed. Only after classified files began opening in the 1970s did historians piece together the full scope of PWE operations. Delmer published his memoirs Black Boomerang in 1962, but many details remained censored. Complete archives weren't released until the 1990s. Even then, some PWE veterans refused to discuss their work. The psychological weight of the deception campaigns haunted some participants, impersonating dead soldiers, forging documents to spread paranoia, broadcasting pornography to attract listeners. These weren't heroic commando raids or brilliant tactical maneuvers. They were calculated psychological manipulation of entire populations. Effective, yes, but morally ambiguous in ways that troubled some who participated. Yet the strategic necessity was undeniable. Britain in 1940-1941 faced possible defeat. The Wehrmacht's war machine seemed unstoppable. Goebbels' propaganda apparatus controlled the narrative across occupied Europe. PWE's black propaganda created a strategic asymmetry. Germany had to defend against both external Allied military pressure and internal psychological subversion. Resources spent hunting phantom resistance cells were resources unavailable for genuine security. Morale degraded by constant subtle demoralization couldn't be restored with official propaganda. Germans no longer trusted. The operations revealed fundamental truths about information warfare. The most effective deception is indistinguishable from truth. The best propaganda exploits existing doubts rather than creating new beliefs. Trust is harder to build than to destroy, and PWE systematically destroyed German trust in their own communications. The impact on post-war intelligence doctrine was profound. PWE's methodology became foundational to Western psychological warfare operations. The CIA studied PWE operations when developing Cold War propaganda strategies. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty used PWE's grey propaganda techniques. The principle of attacking enemy morale through their own communications infrastructure became standard doctrine. Every subsequent psychological warfare operation, from Korea to Vietnam to the Cold War, drew on lessons PWE pioneered. The irony is that PWE succeeded by becoming better Nazis than the Nazis. Der Chef sounded more authentically Prussian than most actual Nazi broadcasters. Soldatensender Calais provided more reliable Wehrmacht intelligence than German military communications. PWE's forged documents were more convincingly Nazi than documents the Reich Propaganda Ministry produced. The German soldiers listening to Soldatensender Calais on the night of June 5, 1944, heard what they thought was their own radio service. A familiar voice. Jazz music they loved, but the regime had banned. News about troop movements they needed to know. They had no idea they were hearing a British operation broadcasting from a bunker in Sussex, transmitted through the most powerful radio station in the world, scripted by German refugees who'd fled Hitler, all coordinated by a journalist born in Berlin who spoke German better than most Germans. The greatest deception wasn't what PWE said. It was what PWE was. A phantom Nazi resistance that never existed. A Wehrmacht radio service that was actually enemy intelligence. A voice of German patriotism that originated from Germany's mortal enemy. When the war ended, German intelligence officers learned the truth about PWE operations. Some refused to believe it. Others felt genuine professional admiration for the sophistication of the deception. A few experienced something like philosophical vertigo, realizing they'd been convinced by propaganda that they'd recognized as propaganda, but couldn't resist anyway. That was PWE's final victory, not just fooling the enemy, but fooling them so thoroughly that learning the truth didn't diminish their respect for the deception. The political warfare executive proved that in modern warfare, the perception of reality matters more than reality itself. That trust is a weapon that can be captured and used against those who originally possessed it. That the most dangerous lies are told in the enemy's own voice. Sefton Delmer died in 1979, largely forgotten outside intelligence circles. Peter Seckelmann, Der Chef, returned to obscurity. Agnes Burnell, Vicky, went on to a career in theatre. The thousands of PWE staff who forged documents, wrote scripts, monitored broadcasts, and ran intelligence networks dispersed into civilian life. Most took their secrets to the grave, bound by lifetime secrecy agreements. But their work reshaped how democracies fight authoritarian regimes. They demonstrated that information warfare could achieve strategic effects impossible through conventional military force alone. That psychological operations could complement kinetic operations to create cascading advantages. That in the battle for minds, authenticity is more valuable than truth. The black propaganda operations against Nazi Germany revealed a paradox that remains relevant today. The most effective way to combat totalitarian control of information is to become temporarily more skilled at manipulating information than the totalitarians. To fight propaganda with superior propaganda. To counter deception with more sophisticated deception. This is an uncomfortable truth for democratic societies committed to transparency and truth-telling. But it's a truth that PWE's operations made undeniable. When British intelligence officers sat down in 1941 to figure out how to fight Goebbels' propaganda machine, they concluded something radical. They couldn't fight propaganda with truth. Truth was too easily dismissed as enemy lies. They had to fight propaganda with propaganda that appeared to be German truth. They had to become better Nazis than the Nazis, more convincing, more authentic, more trusted. And they succeeded so completely that even today historians debate whether certain Nazi resistance broadcasts were genuine or PWE operations. Some myths PWE created became so embedded in the historical record that they're still cited as facts. The station that never existed in Germany is remembered in Germany. The soldiers who never transmitted are part of Wehrmacht mythology. The resistance that was entirely fictional is treated as historical reality. This is the ultimate measure of PWE's success. They didn't just fool people during the war. They created historical facts through deception so thorough it became indistinguishable from truth. Peter Seckelmann's voice as Der Chef was heard by millions. Not one of them knew they were hearing a Jewish refugee reading scripts written in England. Not one suspected the fanatical Nazi voice was actually a persecuted artist who'd fled the regime. Not one imagined that the patriotic Prussian officer was a bomb disposal technician with a talent for accents. The Gestapo arrested hundreds searching for Der Chef. They interrogated radio technicians. They analyzed broadcasting patterns. They deployed their most sophisticated counterintelligence operations. They never found him because he was sitting safely in a converted house in Bedfordshire, drinking tea between broadcasts, recording voices on glass discs, and laughing at the confusion he was creating 600 miles away. When the final broadcast of Gustav Siegfried Ein's aired in November 1943, with Der Chef being killed by Gestapo raiders, German intelligence officers felt they'd finally succeeded. They'd found the traitor. They'd silenced the underground. They'd restored communication security. The truth was more devastating. There was no traitor to find. There was no underground to silence. There was no security breach to fix. The entire thing was British intelligence having a laugh at German intelligence's expense. A laugh that cost Germany countless man-hours, immense resources, and immeasurable morale damage. Soldatensender Calais broadcast for 543 consecutive nights, over 16 months of continuous programming. Jazz, news, weather, sports, and subtle psychological warfare delivered every night from dusk to dawn. German commanders relied on its broadcasts for tactical intelligence. German soldiers tuned in religiously for entertainment. German intelligence monitored every broadcast, trying to exploit it for counterintelligence purposes. All of them were being systematically deceived by British intelligence, using German communications against Germany, with German listeners unable to tell the difference between their own media and enemy propaganda. This was information warfare perfected, not crude propaganda easily dismissed, but sophisticated psychological operations that exploited the enemy's trust in their own communications infrastructure. The lesson has echoed through every subsequent conflict, from Cold War broadcasts to modern information operations, from radio broadcasts to social media. The fundamental principle remains: the best way to spread your message is to disguise it as the enemy's message. The political warfare executive demonstrated that in the battle for minds, the most powerful weapon isn't truth or lies. It's credibility. And credibility can be stolen, forged, and wielded against those who originally possessed it. Every intelligence service in the world learned this lesson from PWE's operations against Nazi Germany. Some applied it more skillfully than others. None matched the audacity of Gustav Siegfried Ein's and Soldatensender Calais, phantom stations that never existed, broadcasting from locations that were fictional, trusted by millions who should have known better. Der Chef's voice went silent in November 1943. But the deception he represented continues. In every conflict where information itself becomes a battlefield. In every operation where the enemy's voice is captured and turned against them. In every broadcast where distinguishing authentic from fabricated requires capabilities most audiences don't possess. The political warfare executive's black propaganda operations proved a fundamental principle of modern warfare. In the age of mass communications, controlling what the enemy hears is more valuable than controlling what territory they occupy. Hitler's Wehrmacht conquered most of Europe, but British intelligence conquered something more valuable: German soldiers' trust in their own communications. When the war ended and German intelligence officers learned about PWE operations, they experienced a collective shock. The stations they'd trusted, the broadcasts they'd relied upon, the intelligence they'd analyzed, all of it was enemy deception, delivered so skillfully they'd never suspected the truth. Some German officers expressed grudging professional respect. Others felt betrayed and humiliated. A few simply refused to believe it, insisting that some of the broadcasts must have been genuine German resistance. That denial itself was PWE's greatest triumph. They'd created deception so convincing that even after the truth was revealed, victims couldn't fully accept they'd been fooled. The irony was perfect. Germany, the nation that had elevated propaganda to a state function under Goebbels, had been defeated in the propaganda war by British intelligence operating from a converted estate in Bedfordshire. The Wehrmacht that conquered France in 6 weeks couldn't locate a radio station broadcasting from inside what they thought was German-controlled territory. Because the station was actually 600 miles away in enemy territory, transmitted by a 500-kilowatt monster transmitter the Nazis couldn't jam, voiced by refugees the Nazis had persecuted, scripted by journalists the Nazis had tried to arrest. Every broadcast was revenge. Every German soldier who trusted der Chef's voice was being fooled by the people Hitler had tried to eliminate. Every Wehrmacht officer who relied on Soldatensender Calais for intelligence was receiving British intelligence disguised as German intelligence. The symmetry was poetic. The effectiveness was undeniable. Total German military personnel who heard PWE broadcasts, conservatively estimated at 15–20 million. Number of PWE black propaganda stations operational by 1944, 14. Leaflets distributed by PWE operations, over 600 million. Forged documents produced, millions, in over 50 different document types. Cost in British pounds, approximately $2.5 million annually. Cost in German resources, incalculable. Hours German counterintelligence spent hunting phantom transmitters, tens of thousands. Hours RAF bombers spent distributing leaflets, thousands. Hours PWE staff spent monitoring German communications to maintain deception, hundreds of thousands. Impact on German morale, impossible to quantify precisely, but post-war interrogations suggested profound and widespread effects. Over 50% of German POWs admitted consuming PWE propaganda. Many reported it influenced their decision-making, even when they suspected it was Allied propaganda. The operations validated a controversial principle. Propaganda is most effective when the audience knows it's propaganda, but consumes it anyway because it's entertaining, useful, or emotionally satisfying. Soldatensender Calais succeeded because German soldiers needed what it provided. Jazz music banned by the regime. News more accurate than official Wehrmacht communications. Weather reports and sports scores denied by Goebbels' media blackout. They knew, or strongly suspected, it was Allied propaganda. They listened anyway, because the propaganda gave them what German media wouldn't: reliable information mixed with entertainment. This insight transformed post-war psychological operations. The goal wasn't making enemies believe your propaganda was true. The goal was making your propaganda more useful to enemies than their own media. When your propaganda is more reliable than enemy official communications, you've won the information war. PWE achieved that by 1944. German commanders trusted British propaganda more than German military intelligence. That reversal of information superiority was unprecedented in military history. It demonstrated that in total war, every dimension of conflict is interconnected. Tactical victories on the battlefield, strategic deceptions in intelligence operations, psychological warfare against enemy morale. PWE's operations showed these weren't separate wars, but facets of a single struggle. Information operations enabled tactical deceptions. Tactical successes validated information operations. The entire system reinforced itself. By D-Day, German intelligence was so thoroughly compromised by double-cross agents, so systematically deceived by Operation Fortitude, so continuously demoralized by PWE propaganda, that they couldn't distinguish truth from deception. When the invasion came at Normandy, German commanders hesitated. Was this the main attack, or the faint Soldatensender Calais had hinted was coming? That hesitation, those crucial hours of delay, came partly from information warfare, from months of accumulated deception creating ambient uncertainty, from psychological operations that made German intelligence doubt their own assessments. PWE didn't win the war, but they contributed to victory in ways that saved countless Allied lives. Every German soldier demoralized by black propaganda was a soldier less effective in combat. Every hour German counterintelligence spent hunting phantom resistance was an hour not spent on real security threats. Every Wehrmacht officer who trusted Soldatensender Calais was an officer making decisions based on British intelligence masquerading as German intelligence. The accumulated effect was strategic advantage impossible to achieve through conventional military operations alone. And it came from one fundamental insight: the enemy's voice is more credible to the enemy than your voice could ever be. So steal the enemy's voice, forge it, perfect it, use it against them. That's what the political warfare executive did. That's what Sefton Delmer, Peter Seckelmann, Agnes Bernell, and 1,000 intelligence officers, forgers, broadcasters, and analysts accomplished between 1941 and 1945. They didn't just fool Hitler's intelligence services, they fundamentally changed how democracies fight authoritarian regimes. They proved that information warfare could achieve strategic effects. They demonstrated that psychological operations weren't auxiliary to military operations, but integral to total victory. And they did it all from a converted estate in Bedfordshire, broadcasting from underground bunkers in Sussex, using refugee actors to impersonate Nazis, creating the most sophisticated deception campaign in military history. A campaign so successful that even today, 75 years after the war ended, some of its deceptions remain embedded in historical memory. Some of its phantom resistance fighters are still believed to have existed. Some of its forged documents are still cited as authentic. Because the best propaganda doesn't just deceive, it becomes truth. It creates facts. It reshapes reality itself. That was the political warfare executive's ultimate achievement. Not temporary battlefield deception, but permanent historical deception so thorough that separating truth from fabrication requires access to classified archives that remained sealed for 50 years. Peter Seckelmann's voice as Der Chef echoed across Germany for 700 broadcasts. Millions heard him. None knew him. All trusted him, or wanted to trust him, because he sounded more authentically German than their own media. That was the con. That was the genius. That was how Britain fought back when conventional warfare seemed hopeless. With words, perfectly calibrated words, delivered in the enemy's own voice, until the enemy could no longer trust their own communications. Until German soldiers tuning their radios couldn't tell which stations were German and which were British. Until Wehrmacht officers relied on enemy intelligence, thinking it was German intelligence. Until the entire Nazi propaganda apparatus Goebbels had built came crashing down under the weight of its own compromised credibility. The political warfare executive didn't destroy that apparatus with counter-propaganda. They hijacked it. They became it. They used it against itself. And in doing so, they demonstrated a principle that remains relevant today in an era of information warfare, cyber operations, and digital propaganda. The most devastating attack on an authoritarian information system isn't contradiction, it's replication. Become the enemy's voice. Speak with the enemy's authority. Build trust in that voice, then use that trust to destroy the enemy from within. That's what Gustav Siegfried Eins and Soldaten Sender Calais accomplished. That's what the forged documents, impersonated soldiers, and pornographic broadcasts achieved. That's what a journalist from Berlin, a refugee from Germany, and 1,000 intelligence professionals created in the English countryside. The greatest deception in military history. A deception so complete that discovering the truth only deepened respect for how thoroughly they'd been fooled. A deception that didn't end when the war ended, because some of its effects persist to this day. The black propaganda unit that fooled Hitler's intelligence services succeeded because they understood something fundamental about human psychology. People want to believe convenient truths more than inconvenient truths. They trust familiar voices more than foreign voices. They accept propaganda that confirms their suspicions more readily than propaganda that contradicts their beliefs. PWE exploited every one of these tendencies. They gave German soldiers propaganda that sounded German, confirmed their fears about party corruption, and provided information they actually needed. The soldiers knew it might be propaganda. They consumed it anyway, because it was useful propaganda, better propaganda than their own side provided. When enemy propaganda becomes more reliable than official communications, you've lost the information war. Germany lost that war by 1944, and the British black propaganda operations were a primary reason why. Sefton Delmer's obituary in 1979 barely mentioned his wartime work. The operations remained classified. The full story couldn't be told, but within intelligence communities around the world, his legacy was secure. He'd pioneered information warfare techniques that became doctrine. He'd proven psychological operations could achieve strategic effects. He'd demonstrated that in the battle for minds, creativity mattered more than resources. The political warfare executive operated on a fraction of the budget the Reich propaganda ministry commanded. They employed a tiny fraction of Goebbels's staff. They controlled no domestic media infrastructure, yet they defeated the Nazi propaganda apparatus by being smarter, more creative, and more willing to exploit human psychology without restraint. The moral ambiguity of their methods troubled some participants, but the strategic necessity was undeniable, and the effectiveness was unquestionable. In the end, words did what bombs couldn't. Broadcasts achieved what battlefield victories couldn't. Deception accomplished what truth couldn't. The British black propaganda unit that fooled Hitler's intelligence services proved that in total war, every weapon matters. Even voices in the dark, speaking lies that sounded like truth, broadcast from phantoms that never existed, trusted by millions who should have known better. That was PWE's achievement. That was their legacy. That was how Britain fought back when all seemed lost, with perfect deception delivered in the enemy's own voice, until the enemy no longer knew which voice was their own. 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 Voice was their